I'd like to ask you, what actually is wrong with the climate debate today? In your book, you talk about the politicization of the issue, but you also talk about confusion about definitions and confusion about carbon policy versus climate policy. So if you wouldn't mind starting out telling us, what's the debate we're having and what's the debate we should be having?
Yeah, to answer this question, it's probably worth going back to the beginning. And it's been almost 50 years, depending on how you count, 50 years, certainly 40 years, since scientists first began warning that humans are influencing the climate system in a way that could lead to negative impacts, perhaps profound negative impacts. That role of humans in the climate system is very complex, and it gets more complex the more we learn. But for many decades, since the 1970s, it's been recognized that carbon dioxide is a primary driver of climate change, resulting from human emissions from industrial activity. Now, one of the problems with the debate is that despite this recognition that carbon dioxide is accumulating in the atmosphere, perhaps leading to potentially negative outcomes, it keeps rising. And during the time period since the late 1990s, when the world became much more serious about the issue, the pace of increase, aside from the economic slowdown, has accelerated. So in a very real sense, if we are concerned about limiting carbon dioxide, the policy debate is moving us in the wrong direction. It's becoming more and more intense, but action isn't actually occurring.
I think every scientist I've heard speak has said you can't attribute a specific event to human-caused climate change. So that right there seems like a non-starter if you have to prove causality.
That's right, and it shows how the political definition of climate change, in a very real sense, has deviated from what most scientists would say. If you've experienced an extreme event in a developing country, of course you're going to say, well, we think this is related to greenhouse gas emissions, because that's a necessary statement to make to free up funding in the international process. At the same time, if scientists are being very cautious and accurately reflecting the science and saying, well, no one event can be attributed, all of a sudden we've set the stage for a politicization of the science, because money hinges on how that argument comes out.
Perhaps related to this, you've criticized climate scientists at times for being alarmist and for sort of conjuring fear as a way to motivate political action. But as we all know, sometimes politicians don't have time for the nuances, and the media certainly doesn't a lot of the time. They're sort of demanding certainty. What's a scientist to do?
Yeah, it's important, I think, for experts. And to me, it doesn't matter if their expertise is in Middle East politics or climate science, or it's your doctor, to recognize they have a really special role in our society. I have no real issues with politicians or even advocacy groups who go out and try to stretch the science or to push knowledge as far as they can in trying to make the best case for the course of action that they recommend. That's just politics. That's advocacy at work. But there are people in our society that we look to play it straight. That might be intelligence agencies. It might be government advisory bodies. But it also, by and large, is the public scientific community that we expect is going to represent knowledge and fairly, and not exaggerate, not push things too far. And this is on all sides of the debate. What's at stake is that if people lose some sense of legitimacy in these advisory bodies, then we're going to be doing without expert knowledge, because expert knowledge then just becomes that knowledge which you think you can pick to best make your political case. And we've substituted politics for science in a very real sense. So organizations like the IPCC, I have been very critical of because at times it's gone beyond its remit, which is to faithfully summarize the state of the science. The case for action on climate change, I think, is strong enough such that the scientific community can play it straight and doesn't have to exaggerate or go beyond what the science can hold.
So if the case is strong enough, why have so many felt the need to maybe go beyond?
Yeah, well, there's a big frustration that a lot of people have, going back to my earlier comments, that despite concern about the problem, we're moving in the wrong direction. And there is this sense among many people that if only the level of concern or the intensity of people's feelings about climate change were ratcheted up high enough, then that would motivate a response. And it turns out, if you look at opinion polls, and I summarize a number of them in my book. Over the last 20 years, public opinion on climate change has been very strong, both in support of the overwhelming scientific consensus and also in support of action. It goes up and down with events. In a cold winter, it'll go down, and hot summer, it goes up, but it's been very stable. The argument I make is that we suffer a deficit of good policies. That's what's holding us back. The problem isn't with the people. The problem is with people like me, policy wonks and policy experts who have brought into the political process a series of policy proposals that are inherently flawed, that they're not going to work. There's nothing wrong with that. Public policymaking is really difficult. Where I see the main problem in the climate debate is an overwhelming unwillingness to let go of those bad policy proposals. How many times does cap and trade have to get voted down in the Senate before we say, well, maybe that's not going to work? How many times does the international process have to end in no progress or even spectacular failure, such as at Copenhagen last year, before we say, all right, let's try something else? You see this in many areas of policy, whether it was healthcare or fighting wars. One thing that wise policy does is that it adapts to circumstances. You don't just continue to try to apply the same failed policies that didn't work before. You evolve policies and you try something new. The climate debate has been unique because of its almost impermeability to new ideas, new policy approaches.